Hank Williams, also known as the Hillbilly Shakespeare, was the first artist inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame.
Hank Williams died young, rich, and alone, with more questions than answers left behind. To this day, no one fully agrees on what really happened during that last ride. There's more to this story than you've heard, and it gets stranger the deeper you go. Join us as we uncover the full story of Hank Williams' mysterious death, the making of a legend in Alabama. Hank Williams was born as Hiram King Williams on September 17, 1923, in a small farming community called Mount Olive in Butler County, Alabama. His parents were Lon Williams and Lily Williams, two hard-working but poor people who were typical of rural Alabama families at the time. Life in the Deep South during the 1920s was already hard, but for Hank, it was even harder right from the start. Hank was born with a condition called spina bifida occulta. It's a birth defect where the bones in the spine don't form properly. For some people, this condition doesn't cause much trouble, but for Hank it meant pain, lots of it, for most of his life. Doctors didn't fully understand or treat it properly in those days, especially for poor families. This pain would later play a big role in how Hank dealt with life, music, and eventually, his personal problems. His early family life was unstable. Hank's father, Lon, was a World War I veteran who had been badly injured in the war. In 1930, when Hank was only 7, Lon was sent to a veterans hospital for many years. That left Lily Williams, Hank's strong-willed mother, to raise him and his siblings alone. Lily was tough. She worked multiple jobs to keep the family going, from canning vegetables to running boarding houses. She was also ambitious for Hank. She believed he had talent and wanted to help him become a star, but their relationship was complicated. But something good came out of that difficult childhood: music. Music became Hank's escape and his passion. He was first exposed to songs at church where he learned hymns and gospel music, but that was only the start. On the streets of Georgiana, Alabama, Hank met a man who would change his life: Rufus T. Tot Payne. T. Tot was an African-American street musician, and he taught young Hank how to play the guitar. More importantly, T. Tot taught him about blues music, the deep, emotional songs that spoke about suffering, heartbreak, and hope. T. Tot didn't just teach Hank chords, he showed him how to express pain and feeling through music. Hank stood on street corners watching T. Tot play, listening closely to every note. This combination of church gospel and street blues shaped Hank's unique sound. Later on, when Hank wrote songs like "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry," you could hear both influences mixed together: sadness, faith, and the raw feeling of the blues. Even though Hank was just a white kid from Alabama, his music already carried the pain of both his personal life and the larger struggles of the South at the time. Despite his troubles, Hank showed talent from an early age. He won local talent contests and started performing wherever he could: street corners, local dances, and small radio spots. One of the first big steps in his career was landing a radio show on WSFA, a small station in Montgomery, Alabama. He was still a teenager, but people already recognized that his voice was special. Even though he didn't have formal music training, Hank had something better: a natural ability to write simple, powerful songs about everyday life, love, loss, and loneliness. It was during this time that he formed his band, the Drifting Cowboys, and began touring around Alabama and neighboring states. These were small-time shows, town fairs, school auditoriums, and even wrestling matches. But for Hank, they were the early training grounds that helped shape him into the performer he would become. Hank's early songs and radio shows began attracting a larger audience, especially in the South. People related to his words because they came from real experience. Hank didn't just sing songs, he told stories, and those stories were often about heartache, rejection, and dreams that never quite came true. By the time he was in his late teens, it was clear to everyone around him that Hank Williams wasn't just another local singer, he was on his way to something bigger. And as you'll see next, fame would come quickly for Hank, but so would even more trouble: meteoric rise and personal chaos. By the time Hank Williams was in his early 20s, the pieces of his career were starting to come together. After years of performing at small shows and on local radio stations in Alabama, he got his first real shot at recording in 1946. His first recordings were with a small label called Sterling Records. He recorded a handful of songs with them, but they didn't get much attention. Still, it was enough to catch the interest of someone bigger. That someone was Fred Rose, a well-known songwriter and music publisher who co-owned Acuff Rose Music in Nashville. Rose saw raw talent in Hank, not just as a performer, but as a songwriter who could reach people's emotions. In 1947, Rose helped Hank sign a deal with MGM Records, a major label at the time. This was the beginning of Hank's real music career. Hank's first big hit came with the song Move It On Over in 1947. It was a fun, upbeat song with a catchy rhythm and playful lyrics. It got people's attention and introduced Hank's voice to a national audience. The song climbed the country music charts and made Hank a name to watch. But it was in 1949 that Hank truly broke through with the song Lovesick Blues. It was a cover of an older tune, but Hank's version was full of life. He brought something new to it. His voice cracked in places and he sang with real emotion. Listeners hadn't heard anything like it. Lovesick Blues became a massive hit, staying at the top of the Billboard Country chart for 16 weeks. Suddenly, Hank Williams was a star. He was invited to perform at the Grand Ole Opry, the most famous country music show in America. When he first sang Lovesick Blues on the Opry stage, the crowd demanded 6 encores, a rare thing in those days. It was clear Hank wasn't just popular, he was changing country music. His songs were simple but powerful, full of heartache, love, and longing. People connected to them because they felt real, and they were. Being part of the Grand Ole Opry was the highest honor in country music. For Hank, it was a dream come true. He became a regular performer and toured all across the country. But while his fame was growing, so were his personal problems. Hank had already been drinking for years, but fame made things worse. He had to perform constantly, travel long distances, and deal with the pressure of keeping his success going. His chronic back pain from spina bifida made things even harder. To cope, he drank more and started using painkillers and prescription drugs. This began affecting his work. He started missing shows. When he did perform, sometimes he was so drunk he couldn't remember the words to his own songs. By 1952, just 3 years after his famous debut at the Opry, Hank was fired for repeatedly missing shows and showing up intoxicated. It was a huge blow. The Opry was like a second home to him, and losing it hurt deeply. But the people around him didn't know what to do. He was too valuable to ignore, but too unstable to depend on. The price of fame. While all this was happening in his professional life, Hank's personal life was no less chaotic. In 1944, he met Audrey Shepard, a recently divorced woman with a young child. Hank was drawn to her confidence and drive. They married in 1944, before her divorce was even final. It was the start of a very complicated relationship. Audrey wasn't just Hank's wife. She also tried to be his manager, booking his shows and helping with his career. Some people say she pushed him too hard. Others believe she helped him stay focused in those early years. Either way, their relationship was filled with fighting, jealousy, and mistrust. They separated multiple times, but kept getting back together. Audrey wanted to be a singer too, but she didn't have Hank's talent. Still, she insisted on singing with him and appearing in his shows. Hank, torn between love and frustration, gave in. Their duets were awkward, and most people agreed Audrey didn't belong on stage. But Hank, either out of love or guilt, kept trying to make it work. Their marriage was strained not just by fame, but by Hank's behavior. As he got more successful, he also became more reckless. He had affairs with multiple women, some of them long-term. He fathered children he didn't always acknowledge or support. His relationship with his own son, Hank Williams Jr., was distant. The boy was still a toddler when his father died. The emotional damage from Hank's chaotic life left its mark on everyone around him. Hank's songs during this time reflected all this pain. He wrote about love, betrayal, regret, and loneliness. Songs like Your Cheatin' Heart, Cold, Cold Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, and You Win Again weren't just hits. They were personal. Listeners could hear the real heartbreak behind every word. Even when he wasn't writing about his life directly, his emotions were always there. He had a rare gift, turning suffering into something beautiful. By 1952, Hank's career was on shaky ground. He was still writing incredible songs, but he was losing everything else: his marriage, his reputation, and his grip on reality. Illness, addiction, and self-destruction. By the early 1950s, Hank Williams was one of the biggest names in American music. His songs were everywhere. Radio stations played his records daily. Fans showed up to his shows expecting to see the same bright star who had thrilled them with hits like Lovesick Blues and Cold, Cold Heart. But behind that fame, Hank's life was falling apart. His health, his personal life, and his career were all heading toward disaster, and he couldn't stop it. Hank's physical problems had been with him since birth. His condition, spina bifida occulta, caused him chronic pain in his lower back. This was a time before modern treatments, before physical therapy was common, and before many doctors even fully understood the condition. Hank didn't just live with pain, he fought it every single day. Standing on stage for hours, traveling long distances, and lifting instruments only made the pain worse. In the early years of his career, Hank managed the pain mostly with alcohol. It numbed things temporarily, and drinking was a normal part of the honky-tonk world he played in. But as the years went on, simple drinking wasn't enough. Hank began using pain pills and eventually morphine to handle the constant ache in his back. Morphine was strong and it worked, but it also hooked him quickly. Before long, Hank was depending on it just to function. By 1952, Hank wasn't just a man in pain, he was a man falling apart. Friends and family noticed his appearance changing. His skin looked pale and sickly. He was losing weight rapidly. His once energetic performances were replaced with weak, sometimes slurred singing. People described him as looking like a skeleton with a guitar. There were even stories from some of his last shows where audience members said he looked like a shadow of his former self, barely able to stand for his set. Instead of clapping with excitement, people began watching him with concern. On top of everything else, Hank's heart was beginning to give out. The years of heavy drinking, drug use, and untreated physical problems were finally catching up with him. Doctors warned him that he couldn't keep going like this, but by then, Hank didn't seem to care. He had reached a point where living hurt more than stopping. As Hank's health got worse, so did his dependence on drugs. This wasn't the kind of careful medical treatment we think of today. It was messy, dangerous, and controlled by people who didn't have Hank's best interest at heart. One of those people was Horace Toby Marshall. Marshall wasn't a real doctor. He was a con man who had once been in prison for forgery. Somehow, he managed to convince people that he was a medical expert. Hank trusted him. Or maybe Hank just didn't care by that point. Either way, Marshall began giving Hank morphine injections to help him deal with the pain and anxiety. These injections gave Hank short-term relief, but they also sent him deeper into addiction. Morphine made him foggy, sleepy, and unreliable. There were times when he would show up for a show but be too sick or too drugged to perform. Sometimes he missed the shows entirely, leaving angry promoters and disappointed fans behind. Even in the recording studio, things were falling apart. What should have been quick, easy recording sessions sometimes took hours or days because Hank couldn't focus, couldn't sing clearly, or didn't show up at all. More and more, his career was being run by people who wanted money from him, not people who wanted to help him. Managers, fake doctors, and promoters saw Hank as a paycheck. As long as he could stand on a stage or sit in front of a microphone, they kept pushing him, even when it was clear he needed real medical care and rest. As bad as the physical pain and addiction were, something else was happening inside Hank, a kind of emotional and spiritual breakdown. For Hank, music had always been personal. He sang his feelings, whether it was about love, loneliness, or regret. But by the early 1950s, Hank wasn't just writing about pain, he was living it every day. One of the biggest emotional blows came when the Grand Ole Opry fired him in 1952. Being part of the Opry had been Hank's greatest achievement, the symbol that he had truly made it in country music. Losing that honor was like being kicked out of a family. It wasn't just a job loss, it was a personal rejection. The people he had once stood beside on that famous stage now saw him as a problem, a man who couldn't control himself anymore. His personal life was also crumbling fast. In 1952, his divorce from Audrey Shepherd was finalized. Their marriage had been toxic for years, but Hank still cared about her in his own complicated way. With Audrey gone, Hank also drifted further away from his friends, his bandmates, and even his children. By the end of 1952, Hank was physically sick, emotionally broken, addicted, and almost completely alone. He had gone from being America's biggest country star to a fragile, worn-out man barely able to stand on stage. The Last Ride. By the end of 1952, Hank Williams was a broken man. His health was wrecked, his personal life was in shambles, and his career was barely holding together. Yet even with everything going wrong, he was still being booked for shows, still being pushed to perform. One of those shows was scheduled for New Year's Day, 1953, in Canton, Ohio. It would be his last journey, a strange, tragic trip that has become one of the most talked-about stories in American music history. The plan seemed simple enough. Hank was supposed to perform at the Municipal Auditorium in Canton on January 1, 1953. Promoters had already advertised his appearance. Tickets were sold. People expected Hank Williams, the star of country music, to be there on that holiday. But Hank was in no condition to perform. By December 31, 1952, his health was at its lowest point. He had recently been hospitalized for heart problems, and his weight had dropped dangerously. His chronic back pain was worse than ever, and he was heavily relying on alcohol, morphine, and other drugs to numb the pain. The weather didn't help either. A winter storm was moving across the southeast. Snow and ice made driving conditions dangerous. Airlines were canceling flights, and Hank's original plan to fly to Ohio was scrapped. He was stuck in Knoxville, Tennessee on New Year's Eve, trying to figure out how to get to the show. That's when Charles Carr, a 17-year-old Auburn University student, entered the picture. Carr was hired as Hank's chauffeur for the trip. He wasn't a professional driver. He was just a kid doing a job, trying to make some extra money by helping drive a famous but very sick musician to his next gig. They would be traveling in Hank's powder blue 1952 Cadillac. Adding to the pressure, Hank owed money to several promoters. Some people around him, including those booking his shows, were more concerned about making money off Hank than protecting his health. Whether he was ready to sing or not, they expected him to show up. With commercial flights grounded and his personal plane ride unavailable, Hank and Carr set out by car. They left Knoxville late on the night of December 31, 1952. Hank was already in rough shape before they even left. Witnesses later said he looked weak and sick, barely able to sit up straight. Before leaving, someone had reportedly given Hank morphine injections along with a mixture of alcohol. Some reports say these injections were administered by a local doctor or a nurse. Others suggest that Toby Marshall, the con man pretending to be Hank's doctor, may have provided him with more drugs before the trip. No one knows for sure. Either way, Hank was in no shape to be on the road, much less to perform a live concert hundreds of miles away. The Cadillac cut through the snowy highways of the Appalachian Mountains as Charles Carr did his best to stay awake and keep the car on the icy roads. Hank was quiet most of the time, sometimes mumbling, sometimes appearing to be asleep. By the early morning hours of January 1, 1953, they reached Oak Hill, West Virginia. Somewhere between Knoxville and Oak Hill, Hank Williams died. But exactly when and where he died remains a mystery to this day. One of the biggest questions is whether Hank was already dead when they left Knoxville, or whether he died somewhere along the way. Some eyewitnesses claimed they saw Hank slumped over in the back seat earlier in the trip, motionless, and possibly already gone. Others said he was alive in Knoxville, seen being carried to the car by hotel workers because he was too weak to walk on his own. Even Charles Carr, who was driving the car, couldn't tell exactly when Hank passed away. Carr later said that sometime near Oak Hill, he noticed that Hank wasn't responding when spoken to. He described Hank as being stiff, with blue lips, and completely unresponsive. Carr pulled the car over at a gas station to ask for help. Who gave Hank his final dose of morphine is also still debated. Was it a local physician doing what he thought was right? Was it Toby Marshall or someone working on his behalf? Some people have suggested the possibility of foul play, although no hard evidence has ever supported that claim. Others believe it was simply heart failure brought on by a combination of alcohol, drugs, and Hank's already fragile condition. An official autopsy later listed insufficiency of the right ventricle of the heart as the cause of death, but that only deepened the mystery for many people. When the police arrived at the gas station in Oak Hill, they found Hank's body lying in the back seat of the Cadillac. His lips were blue, his skin was cold, and signs of rigor mortis had already begun. It was clear that he had been dead for some time. The officers on duty had no idea at first who they were dealing with. It wasn't until they checked his identification that they realized they were looking at the lifeless body of Hank Williams, one of the biggest stars in American music. Local officials handled the situation with respect, but soon word got out. As the news of Hank's death spread, reporters swarmed Oak Hill, turning the small town into the center of a national story. Across the country, radio stations interrupted their regular programming to announce the sudden death of the 29-year-old singer. Fans were stunned. How could someone so young, so famous, and so talented be gone just like that? Meanwhile, Hank's family tried to manage the chaos. His mother, Lily Williams, and his ex-wife Audrey were both devastated. Audrey, despite their divorce, immediately stepped in to help organize Hank's funeral. They wanted to keep certain details private, but it was nearly impossible to control the story. America wanted to know everything about Hank's mysterious last ride. The strange cast of characters. Hank Williams didn't go through his decline and final days alone. Around him was a strange and often troubling group of people. Some were family, some were friends, and some were people who saw Hank as nothing more than a paycheck. These characters played big roles in his final chapter, whether by accident, by bad choices, or by pure greed. Understanding who they were helps explain why things got so bad for Hank at the end of his life. One of the most infamous people in Hank's story is Horace "Toby" Marshall. Marshall wasn't a doctor at all. He was a forger and scam artist with a long history of getting into trouble. Before he met Hank, he had already served prison time for forgery. Somehow, after getting out of prison, he managed to fool people into thinking he was a medical expert. Marshall called himself Dr. C.W. Lemon when he worked with Hank. He would write prescriptions, give injections, and act like he knew what he was doing. In truth, he had no medical training at all. But by the early 1950s, Hank was desperate. He was in constant pain from his back problems and suffering from anxiety, alcoholism, and depression. He was willing to trust just about anyone who claimed they could help him feel better. Toby Marshall quickly became one of Hank's regular sources for morphine injections and other medications. Marshall saw a chance to make money by keeping a famous star hooked on drugs, and he took full advantage of it. Whether he thought he was actually helping or whether he only cared about getting paid is hard to say, but the result was the same. Hank's addiction got worse under Marshall's care. After Hank's death, the truth about Toby Marshall started coming out. People wanted answers. Who had been supplying Hank with drugs? Why was someone with no medical license treating him? Marshall was eventually charged with manslaughter, accused of helping cause Hank's death through reckless drug use. However, the charges were dropped, mostly because the exact cause of Hank's death couldn't be proven, and there wasn't enough evidence to make the charges stick. Another key figure in Hank's last days was Charles Carr, the 17-year-old who ended up driving Hank on that final trip. Carr was not a professional chauffeur. He was just a college student who needed a job. His father had connections in the entertainment industry, and that's likely how Charles got the job of helping drive Hank Williams across several states during the holiday season. Why would a famous star like Hank hire a teenager to take him on such an important trip? The truth is that by the end of 1952, Hank's life was so messy that almost nothing made sense anymore. His usual handlers and road managers were either unavailable, didn't want the job, or had been pushed away by Hank's behavior. Charles Carr ended up being the one available to do it. For the rest of his life, Charles Carr had to live with being known as the kid who drove Hank Williams to his death. Carr always insisted that he didn't know Hank was dead until near Oak Hill, West Virginia, when Hank wouldn't respond to him. Carr pulled over for help, but by then, it was too late. Over the years, Carr gave conflicting statements about what happened during that trip. Sometimes the stories changed slightly, and that led to more rumors. Was Hank dead before they even left Knoxville? Did Carr know more than he let on? Carr denied any wrongdoing every time he was asked. One of his most famous quotes was, "I didn't kill Hank Williams." He said he was just a scared young man doing his job, stuck in a tragic situation that was completely out of his control. Even though Carr was never charged with any crime, and no real evidence ever pointed to him doing anything wrong, he carried the weight of that ride for the rest of his life. Besides Toby Marshall and Charles Carr, there were plenty of other people around Hank in his final months who didn't help matters. The music industry was quick to profit from Hank's name, even as his personal life spiraled. Promoters kept booking him for shows even though they knew he was in no shape to perform. Why? Because his name sold tickets whether he showed up or not. In the end, the strange group of people around Hank didn't kill him, but they certainly didn't save him either. He was trapped in a world where addiction, bad advice, and money interests all worked together to push him toward the end. If you want more videos on the untold stories of music legends, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.